Thank you all for joining this important conversation on getting race right, especially within Muslim spaces and institutions, as we reopen the doors. I'm Dalia Mogahed, and I'm the research director at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Now, just to ground our conversation, let me give you just a little bit of background. First, we know that on May 25th, Derek Chauvin, a white Minneapolis police officer, killed George Floyd, a handcuffed Black man in his custody, by holding his knee against Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes until he suffocated and died. In the days since, the streets of more than 100 cities across the United States and the world have been filled with massive protests demanding an end to police brutality and widespread systematic racism. This uprising is also occurring in the midst of COVID-19, a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted Black Americans. Now, although the current protests have brought new public attention to the impact and enduring legacy of racism, this disease has been part of America since its founding, from the genocide of indigenous people to the enslavement of Africans. And also from the very beginning, Black Muslims have been at the forefront of the resistance. In 1522, 20 enslaved Muslim Africans on the island of Hispaniola, then governed by the son of Christopher Columbus, these brave men attacked their enslavers with machetes and freed not only themselves, but a dozen enslaved indigenous people in what was the first recorded slave revolt of the New World. There has never been an America without Black Muslims. From independence to abolition, from the civil rights movement to the current movement for Black lives, Black Muslim history is defined by resilience and struggle. Today, they are the plurality of the American Muslim community. Yet as a group, Black Muslims face a range of challenges due to both Islamophobia and anti-Black racism, which is experienced both outside and inside the Muslim community. And it's the latter that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be addressing anti-Black racism, especially in Muslim spaces and institutions that are led by non-Black Muslims. To lead this conversation, we have two incredible thought leaders and scholars, Imam Dawud Walid and Dr. Jamillah Karim. Imam Dawud is currently the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations and is a member of the Michigan Muslim Community Council, Imam Committee. Walid is widely quoted in media outlets ranging from the New York Times to Fox News, as well as in dozens of books and academic papers as an expert. He lectures across the country in conferences, universities, and at mosques, and is the author of the book Towards Sacred Activism. Dr. Jamillah Karim is an award-winning author, speaker, and blogger. She specializes in race, gender, and Islam in America. Jamillah is co-author of Women of the Nation, Between Black Protest and Sunni Islam, and American Muslim Women, Negotiating Race, Class, and Gender Within the Ummah, which was awarded the 2008 Book Award in Social Sciences by the Association of Asian American Studies. So Jamillah has been working on this for quite a while. She's currently working on a new book, which I can't wait to read, called Radical Love, where she explores the depth and beauty of divine and human love. Jamillah is also a former associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Spelman College. Now, just to set the stage for the conversation, let's first start by taking a look at some research. For anyone who's not familiar, The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding's mission is to provide objective research and education about American Muslims to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. We do it by doing rigorous research, by educating the public, and by equipping and training change makers across the country. To this end, we actually brought together a diverse group of experts in 2015 to address the needs of Muslim youth. And one of the key needs that we identified was intra-Muslim racism. So one of the reports that came out of this convening back in 2015 was this one called Getting Race Right, where we made a number of recommendations specifically to Arab and Desi-led mosques on how to better welcome and be inclusive of African-American Muslim youth. And there were a number of key recommendations. These are the ones that I wanted to highlight for the purposes of this discussion out of this convening that we brought people together for. First is to build anti-racist awareness and capacity, to integrate anti-racist curriculum into both adult and youth education, to deliver khutbahs on intra-Muslim racism. Now there's one I would recommend that ISPU and Yaqeen worked on together as a part of our talk toolkit, specifically on this topic. And to conduct anti-racism training, which Muslim Arc offers a wonderful option for that. Second is to conduct an in-depth needs assessment, to actually listen to people who are impacted rather than assuming. Third is to institutionalize anti-racism by establishing a zero-tolerance policy on racism, to integrate it into the bylaws of the organization, and to make it part of the culture and norms. And then fourth, to create brave spaces for these difficult but important discussions. And we recommended that chaplains be brought in for these discussions because they're trained on intracultural competence. These are Muslim chaplains that might be at a nearby university. So to leverage their leadership to build these spaces to lead these conversations at your center. To ground some of our upcoming conversation in our research, first, Muslims are the most ethnically diverse faith community. We are the only faith community in America without a majority race. However, African Americans or Black Muslims make up the largest percentage of Muslims in America. 28% of Muslims identify as Black or African American. Now, while Black Lives Matter as a movement and as a concept enjoys a lot of support when we ask people in the Muslim community, where Black, Asian, young Muslims in general, and Muslim women are equally likely to say they support the Black Lives Matter movement. This doesn't mean that racism is not a problem in our community. So when you look across Muslims of different backgrounds, all Muslims actually, about a third of every race background say that they have experienced racial discrimination at the hands of another Muslim. Now, they're more likely to say that racism is a problem outside the community, but as many of us will, I think, agree, when it comes from within, it is much more painful. And Black Muslims don't just experience anti-Blackness, they're also dealing with Islamophobia. So there's this double whammy. Black Muslims, though, however, despite these challenges, are among the most likely to say that they will take unpopular stands to defend their faith, more likely than Muslims of other backgrounds. And that's just a brief overview, but if you'd like more resources and research on Black Muslims, you can go to our resource page at ispu.org/Black Muslims. And to learn more, you can sign up for our newsletter And to become a supporter, of course, it is ispu.org/donate. Now I'm going to stop sharing my, if I could have our panelists come back on screen, we'll start our conversation. Great, thank you. Imam Dawud, I want to start with you. Looking at this research and from your vast experience with this topic and with the community, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to tackling the problem of colorism and racism in the Muslim community?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر بالحق بالحق وهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. First of all, Sister Dalia and to the ISPU team, thank you very much for inviting me on to be a part of this timely conversation, this well-needed conversation, and also for ISPU's research on this, because we need to have conversation and deal not simply with emotions, but also deal with facts. So thank you very much. May Allah reward you and your team. So I'm going to discuss this just very briefly from 2 points, and maybe one of them may sound bizarre to some people in the community, and maybe some of my opinions maybe are a little unorthodox, not from a credential perspective, but as far as like my insight. I think that in discussing this issue, Sister Dalia, that we need to even take a step back about how we teach and preach Islam in general in our community. And I think there's been a missing piece in our community that we really have to take a serious look at, because in many of our lectures that I see across the Islamic community, there are talks of political issues, fiqh, and sometimes aqidah. But discussing and emphasizing tazkiyah, or spiritual purification, this is something that is relegated, and in many parts of our community is seen as like a side appendage of Islam instead of something that's very fundamental of how not only we live our lives as individuals, but what we focus on as a community. So in reality, from the way I see it, racism is nothing but, and colorism, these are physical manifestations of metaphysical problems. I mean that they're physical manifestations of spiritual sicknesses, right? So if we only look at things symptomatically, but we don't get to the heart of the matter, and the heart of the matter really is the hearts. And Dr. Sherman Jackson, he says that heart work is the hard work. That's the hardest work, is the hard work, right? Is to deal with these issues, because kibr, arrogance, is one of the primary spiritual diseases that undergirds the issue of racism, that people think they're better, just as Iblis, being the original racist, said, he said, I'm better than him. And he looked down at Adam because his outward creation was fire free of smoke, and Adam was made from the dirt. And this is what a lot has to do in terms of racism, both not just overtly, but also covertly or subtly. So I think that we need more of a spiritual diagnosis in general to all of our societal issues. And this would be, some would say this is tazkiyah, and that's a more comfortable word for some people. For others, it may be tasawwuf, but what are the spiritual remedies that we can harp on and then connect racism directly to these spiritual maladies, such as arrogance, such as envy. And these are two of the most deadly spiritual diseases that inform racism, both on an individual level as well as institutionally. Then I would also say that ignorance is the enemy, right? And we can talk about things theoretically or give things to people in books, but really it's socialization of how can we create meaningful socialization one-on-one, where people then begin to break bread together and go to each other's homes, and where they can literally experience the humanity of other people who don't look like them, right? I think this is the biggest, it's also a big issue that we need to talk about. How are we going to do this very methodically? Like, we just can't assume that it's going to come about organically, especially when many of our communities are separated by invisible walls. Like, I live in Metro Detroit. Detroit is one of America's most segregated metropolitan areas. We literally have invisible walls that separate communities, not just upon economics, but also race. Even in Dearborn, where the majority of Muslims are Arab, we know that the Yemenis are in South Dearborn. If we go over a little further, the Yemenis are the Yemenis are in South Dearborn. And then really the Lebanese live in a different part of Dearborn themselves, right? So even Arabs are segregated in certain circumstances. Same thing with South Asians, between the Hyderabadis in our area who are from Indian immigrants and the Bangladeshis, right? Even they're segregated, and they're all South Asians, or some would say Desis, right? So how can we bring about this socialization, as Allah says that He created us differently? He created us specifically as different ethnic groups and different tribes, but li ta'arafu, right? That we're supposed to get to know one another. And that is an active process. It just can't be something that's passive. So I would just end with that. Maybe those are kind of like maybe a little overly philosophical and not getting to the nuts and bolts about the execution, but I think that it's how we preach and teach Islam to begin with in our community has to be revisited, and that includes how we discuss the spiritual remedies of racism, and then also in terms of how can we as a community more effectively try to bridge the gaps between suburban and urban and the different ethnic groups that we have these silos and these walls that separate us as Muslims.
Thank you so much. You know, I love that you went right to the heart of the issue, as I completely agree that before we can do any of the nuts and bolts, we have to deal with the heart. And it is absolutely a spiritual ailment before it's anything else. And then the point about understanding each other's humanity through experiencing it, I think was vital. Dr. Karima, Dr. Jamillah, you know, coming to you, you write about race relations within the community, especially among women, which I think is a really, I think it's maybe a little different, or maybe there are some uniquenesses. Do you think that there is a different dynamic among women versus men? And how best do we address this rift? And then I'd also like you just to touch on something I know you're very passionate about, which is the role of God's love in healing our hearts. You're muted.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, I definitely think there's a different dynamic when it comes to women. I thought we need to get race right, but we also need to get race and gender right. And to elaborate on that, I want to just first give a little bit more context about my research. I did my research right after 9/11 in Atlanta and Chicago. I was doing field research and looking at relations between African American and South Asian Muslims in these two cities. And again, this was in 2001, so almost 2 decades ago. And the mosque was a primary setting for my research. And I traveled across ethnic mosques in both cities. And by ethnic meaning, you know, we have predominantly African American mosques, and we have predominantly Arab or Desi, or a combination of the two. Generally might say immigrant mosque versus a Black mosque. And so we know, as Dalia told us in the introduction, or explained, reminded us that we are a country that is built on racism. Racism is systemic, it's pervasive, it reaches into every institution, educational, legal, religious. So that also means that it's going to reach into the American Ummah, into our mosque communities, right? And at the same time, I believe that we have these Ummah ideals and other factors that are moving us to cross these boundaries. So as I was, going to these ethnic mosques, I was especially interested in individuals who were also traveling in these different spaces. And also trying to just understand how women's movement in particular occurred, or if it occurred, why it didn't occur, et cetera. And I really found that there was a different dynamic for women that I think in most ways, it actually made their movement and their travel harder. Because for the most part, if a woman, let's say an African-American woman like myself, wanted to venture off into a Pakistani mosque, one of the first questions I'm going to ask myself is, well, do women even attend the mosque? Or where am I going to enter? Am I going to have to go to a side entrance, a back entrance, through the kitchen, the basement, up on a balcony? So like all that discomfort, that's going to discourage you from attending the mosque. So the point is that men, not even Black men, they don't even experience the mosque the way that Black women experience it, right? And I should particularly should say the immigrant mosque. And what I'm talking about, this actually has a name, and this name is intersectionality. Now, that has become a very popular term these days, but it was actually a term that was presented by Black women scholars. Kimberly Crenshaw was the first, but there are other Black women scholars who either drew from her, or altogether, these women were theorizing about the way that women of color, and Black women in particular, experience multiple forms of oppression. So not just gender and race, but also class and religion, et cetera. And so if we take discrimination on the basis of race and gender, these forms of discrimination, they overlap and they intersect in unique ways that adversely impact the groups that are experiencing them, right? And so I'll give you a perfect example. In my book, Women of the Nation of Islam, that's my second book, co-authored with Dawn Marie Gibbon, Dawn Marie, yes. There's a part about a woman, her name is Khalila, and she actually became Sunni in the 1990s. She converted to Islam, and she talks about this experience at the University of Illinois in the MSA. She says that she was the only African-American in the Muslim Student Association and in her local mosque. Her experience was mostly negative, and she attributed this to three major things. One, the way that the Pakistani women did not want to stand next to her in the prayer line. Two, the way that women were jam-packed in an inferior prayer space. And three, an incident with a very dear Pakistani American friend in which she indirectly told Khalila that her Black skin made her ugly. Khalila recalled how hurt she was. Here I was thinking that there was supposed to be no racism in Islam. As time progressed, I stopped going to the masjid and I told myself I was a Muslim in my heart, but I have no desire to be around the Ummah. And then as you read the book, you can imagine what actually happens is that she then joins the Nation of Islam, which is a very unique narrative. You usually hear about people who join the nation and then come to Sunni Islam. She has an opposite narrative because of the discrimination that she experienced in the masjid. And so I think that might be self-explanatory, but just if it's not, to give you one example of what I mean about this overlapping discrimination, like even beauty standards impacted her as a Black woman in a way very different from what a Black man would even experience, right? That alone, right? So it's true that Black men and women, they experience this discrimination in mosques. I think one form is even this idea that we're not practicing correct forms of Islam. Men and women, I imagine, get this, but again, another way that women experience it directly or uniquely is with the standards and norms around dress. I mean, it was a very common experience in the 80s and 90s with women in my community from the Imam Muhammad community, covered women, but we might have a head wrap, where I have a head wrap and then I have this other scarf draped over it. Sometimes they might go just with the head wrap, right? Or the head wrap, the scarf going behind the ears. And they would get these responses, or yes, like you're not covered correctly. And so this is not going to encourage any woman to stay in that place or to visit again. So, you know, that is one example. But I've also seen the ways that the gender injustice and discrimination can bring these women together. And I want to come back to that. I want to come back to that when I talk about the strategies that we can use to address some of these issues. So, and interestingly, my book, American Muslim Women, in the conclusion, I do explore some strategies for overcoming these boundaries, and especially through mosque attendance. But before I look at those, I want to read one line that I read yesterday, the very last page of my conclusion. I wrote, incorporating ihsan in our goal of improving intra-ummah race relations means applying forgiveness, mercy, and preference to others in the face of injustice. So here I'm talking about how we have to implement ihsan, and that's defined as excellence, goodness, but it's heart work. It relates to the heart. It relates to the qualities I just described, forgiveness, mercy, right? And so I thought, wow, that line, it truly does incorporate radical love. And I've defined radical love in various ways. One way that I would describe it here is that it is loving in a way that pleases God and in the most difficult times. It is showing these qualities like forgiveness, because when we have to show forgiveness, it's because we've experienced an offense, right? And so it's some kind of struggle that we're experiencing when these beautiful qualities that Allah loves come out. So, so it's loving it in a way that pleases God in most difficult times. It is showing these qualities that God loves. Again, forgiveness, mercy, preferring others above oneself, selflessness. So the injustice that we're facing, and especially in this moment, or just that is really being brought out in this moment because it's always been going on, this injustice is the dehumanization of Black people, the criminalization of Black people. Again, it is systemic, it is pervasive, and it's long established. So to change the status quo, it's going to require radical change. And it's going to require, to reference the popular hadith, it's going to require that we change it with our hearts, that we change it with our limbs, that we change it with our speech. We're going to have to change it in every way that we can imagine. And the only way you can achieve that radical change is through radical love, meaning that God has to be in it, in the process. God has to be in it, has to be for God, with God, through God. And we have to have God in it because it is exhausting work. I was revisiting the TED Talk by Brian Stevenson. I highly recommend you watch the TED Talk and watch Just Mercy. And there he talks about an opportunity he had to sit with Rosa Parks and other women, Black women in the South, and he would just listen to their conversation. And at a point she turns to him and asks about his work. And he talks about, you know, the work he's trying to do to eliminate mass incarceration and just, you know, all this work around the criminal justice system and its injustice and bias. And then she says, you're going to be tired. And then another woman then says, well, that means that's why you have to be brave. So we have to have a lot in it because it is going to be exhausting. It is exhausting work. It is work that requires courage, right? But when you love Allah that radically, it is possible. And also when you love God that radically, what it really means is that God already loves you, that God has already selected you. And this was kind of the assumption or belief behind my research, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already selected us to be the beloved community, to use Dr. King's term. I believe that he has already selected us. Not that we're going to be the only community, but I believe that we will be leaders. We have to be leaders. And in a lot of ways we already are, but there's still a lot of space for us, as we all know. And two ways that I think of us as leaders in this, or how Allah has already gifted us with this work. One is that he already has gifted us with two of the most celebrated, influential, popular freedom fighters that our history, that our country, but really history has known, and that's Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, right? And the other is that Allah says in the Quran that you are the best community evolved for humanity, enjoining what is right, forbidding what is wrong, and believing in Allah. And some of the commentators do say that this is conditional. It is to be the best ummah is conditional upon us actually doing this work. So, the work is here for us. We're doing it. I love that Dalia invited me to do this in Ramadan. So it was even before the murder of our beloved brother, which again, it's brought the revolution. And so we're grateful. It's so hard to talk about it, but the complexity, because it's obviously a horrific thing that has happened, but we are grateful that he was martyred for us to really wake up and do this work. So that's what I mean. I want to read part of, also one other verse before I read part of my book. Another section of my book is the verse. There's a verse that states, he, referring to God, it is who supports you, referring to the Prophet ﷺ, with his help and with the believers, and brought together their hearts. If you had spent all that is in the earth, speaking to the Prophet ﷺ, you could not have brought their hearts together, but God brought them together. Indeed, he is exalted in might and wise. And I recite this verse because it shows that we have to come to this work with humility, that really it is through Allah that we're going to do this work. He's allowing us to be the hands that are carrying out the work, but the outcome is really with him. The struggle is ours, the outcome is Allah's. But even the Prophet ﷺ, he was able to do his work with Allah's help and with the believers. And that is us. And Allah says that he brought their hearts together. He is the one. So that humility and that prayerfulness of turning to Allah is so important in this work. So in these last few minutes, I want to read a verse, not a verse, but a passage from my book, American Muslim Women, where I give some more practical advice about what we can do. And I actually draw from a quote from another study on immigrant and native-born Americans in Miami. But nonetheless, there were several authors. They wrote that newcomers and Americans successfully come together when, one, each accorded the other equal status and fair treatment, rather than one waiting for the other to change. Two, both shared a sincere interest in some goal, rather than engaging in interaction because someone said they should. And three, cooperation across groups was required to achieve the goal. And Imam Walid, Dawud Walid mentioned the verse of Ta'aruf, of us coming together. So I think these statements so nicely pull all that together, that it's coming to know one another with respect. It is coming to know one another with a genuine interest in learning each other's struggles and their sensitivities, right? And so perhaps one real strategy could mean us coming together, so immigrant mosques actually genuinely bringing African-American and Black leadership to be intentional about it. We have to be intentional to fight racism in this country. So so bringing each other to the table with respect, and also having, these sincere goals a goal that we're working towards. So one example that I have is example of a community in Florida. It was an urban mosque that had really, no one was attending the mosque anymore. They had closed the gates. And even before they closed the gates, the women were not attending the mosque anyway, but they had moved to the suburbs. And we know this example in many communities where immigrant communities started in an urban area and then moved to the suburbs. And so in the community here, even though they had moved out to the suburbs, I guess they had like a majlis or like a board of different masajid or masjids in the city in Florida. They were still, I guess they all had roots in this urban masjid that was now closed, but they really wanted that masjid to open again because many just had a connection to it because it was their first masjid in that city. And so they were looking for an African-American imam because it was in the inner city. And they found an imam who was in the Imam Wardi Muhammad community. And they loved him he had a beautiful Quran recitation. And he told them, he said, well, I'm happy to do this, but I am going to wholeheartedly teach the teachings or, the understanding of Imam Wardi Muhammad. And they were fine with that. And so his wife came with him, and the wife, no women were going to the masjid, but because she started to attend, she was there. There was word that she was there, and some women, either some women who were in the area or women whose husbands might be in the area for work, they would come to the masjid. And these were, mostly Indo-Pakistani women. And so they started coming because of her. And then eventually, these women, they wanted to sit behind a curtain, and she didn't want to. She wanted to sit right behind the men, as she was accustomed to, the wife of the Imam, as she was accustomed to in Wardi Muhammad community masjids. But it really upset her that the women were praying in two separate spaces. So she decided to talk with the women and even compromise with them. And so in the process of compromising them, she said, first of all, that I want you to understand that you don't have to be in a small corner or behind a curtain. And I want you to go read about women's space and educate yourself. So they started to educate themselves. And then she said, okay, well, now that you know that you don't have to be there in the corner, but they still felt comfortable, she decided to actually go behind the curtain with them, which is really kind of interesting dynamic. But the whole point was that she wanted them to feel comfortable still, but she also wanted it to be a moment where the women were educated better about their rights and about their choices and possibilities. So she said, well, at least, even though she was now behind the curtain, she said at least that they had made the choice to do it. But she said after the prayer, the women would be all over the place, which is the example of the Wardi Muhammad communities where, men and women are kind of like free floating, and I'm sure other mosques too. But I thought it was like a really interesting story of these women coming together. And so to go back to those points that were brought in this about coming together with regard for each other, right? And they already had that regard for the African-American imam because they wanted someone to relate to their community, right? They wanted their mosque to be culturally relevant. So he brought that. So I think we really need these kinds of moments, right? We really are valuing each other. And again, we can be intentional in creating those spaces because we have to be, just because of the racist world that we're in. And yeah, I'll stop there. There was another point. Oh yeah, I was gonna say last point is that of course too, when you bring in African-American leadership like that, you're going to be addressing issues of race. And as I mentioned, he said, I'm going to be representing Imam Wardi Muhammad. And that just comes with celebrating African-American culture and intellect and ways of understanding and approaching Islam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamillah.
You're
I always learn something when I listen to you. Imam Dawud, thank you for coming back on, and really appreciate both of you taking the time. I know you're both in incredible demand. We have some questions already coming in, so I want to jump in and start addressing them. So let me start with this one. Thank you for this important discussion. I've realized that many non-Black Muslims are now acknowledging the existence of racism in the Muslim community, but don't seem to know how to fight it and turning to Black Muslims to give them the solutions. As a Black Sunni Muslim woman, I find this a bit frustrating because I've seen non-Black Muslims willfully engage in explicit racism and being complicit to racism for years. My question is, do you have any advice on how to get non-Black Muslims, I think, to engage in self-reflection and to take some ownership in exacerbating racism in the Muslim community and to think of ways that they themselves can change their own racist beliefs about Black people? I understand that educating the non-Black Muslim community is necessary, but I also think that they need to initiate the anti-racist work themselves. Some people are shirking responsibility to not feel guilty about being racist, and it's frustrating after the non-Black Muslims have been inflicting pain on Black Muslims for years. Would either of you like to address that question? I feel as a non-Black Muslim, maybe I should start almost, since it's, Sister Noura, thank you for your question. I'll start by saying that I fully agree with you that this is really hard work. You're talking about hard work. This is the hard work that we have to deal with. We have to undertake and realize that when we're reading the Quran about Fir'aun and about this tyrant and this man who was unjust and enslaved people, that's not something we gloss over as if it has nothing to do with us. Every single one of us has a Fir'aun inside us that we have to conquer. So the idea that racism is somewhere outside and not inside ourselves is really the first problem. I mean, the acknowledgement that we as human beings have diseases of our hearts. We also live in a very racist society, and just as human beings with diseases in our hearts of arrogance and of lack of self-awareness, plus we absorb what is around us, we have to start with ourselves, and it is spiritual work. It's before it's anything else. And then something I'm gonna borrow from something Dr. Jamillah said before is the first word that was revealed is Iqra. The idea of the revolution starts with reading. That was such a beautiful line, and you'll say it better than me, but I really encourage my non-Black Muslim brothers and sisters to read about the history. If I can just take a moment, what we owe to Black people in general, and Black Muslims in particular, for the fact that we're even here. I mean, just for the fact that immigration laws were changed, for the fact that we have something to call back on when we're talking about our civil rights. Imam Dawud fights for the civil rights of all Muslims. The fact that an organization like CAIR, the largest civil rights organization in the largest Muslim civil rights organization in the country, exists and has a civil rights, has civil rights laws to hark back on, that is the product of work and sacrifice of Black Americans. So I think just understanding our own country's history is a really good place to start as well.
If I can jump in, and Sister Noura, may Allah protect you from harm, both physically as well as emotionally. Allah Azza wa Jalla is very clear in the Quran where he says, "Al-mu'minun al-mu'minat ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd," that believing men and women are allies of one another. They're supposed to have each other's backs. And then Allah Azza wa Jalla in that ayah he gives 5 adjectives to then describe who those believers are. They're in allyship with one another. And he says, El Ya'mum Ma'ruf, Yohanan Munkar. Those are the first 2 descriptors of those who enjoy good and forbid evil. So as Black folks who are Muslims need to go in and teach people and who are not Black about the issues of racism and our challenges, we must have Arab and South Asian allies who go and talk to their people and check their own folks. In other words, it's not simply the job of Dr. Jamillah Karim or my good friend Sheikh Mohammed Mendez or Ustada Aisha Prime or myself to go into Arab and South Asian communities and then tell them, oh, please don't be racist to us. No, Arabs and Desis have to step up and check it first in their own family members, check the people who are the board of directors, and more likely they would be able to accept it from you if you can, based upon, you know, the psychology of your people and your culture better than we do. And sometimes it takes a person with inside the group to be the ally and challenge it. And let me remind you that the hadith that is well known, when Abu Dhar radiallahu anh called Bilal radiallahu anh, Yabna Sauda, oh, you son of a Black girl, you son of a Black woman, the Prophet ﷺ immediately stood up and he went and he checked Abu Dhar. But what's important about that, it was an Arab who checked another Arab. The Prophet ﷺ was Arab, and he checked an Arab who was involved in anti-Black racism against an Abyssinian, right? So we need to call forth, if we say we have these friends, we need people who aren't Black to check other people in the Muslim community about anti-Black racism that exists, not only individual, but structurally with inside the Muslim community. This is my belief. Allah knows best.
Jamillah, do you want to jump in on this?
That's okay. We can go to the next question.
Okay. Okay, another question is, thank you for this highly needed discussion. Do you notice any better understanding of intra-Muslim racism among young Muslims compared to the older generation, specifically after immigrant Muslims experienced racialization post 9/11?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, let me, okay, absolutely. I saw that as early as 2001 or right after 9/11. I saw in Chicago, for example, through the Inner City Muslim Action Network, I saw young people volunteering there. And so not only these are South Asians who are from the North suburbs coming into spaces that are feared and usually, you know, they wouldn't go into, but because of Imam's presence there, they were in those communities. So they were doing the work and they were also being educated. They were reading the history and they were able to articulate these injustices. And so for instance, I never forget a young Desi woman who talked about her mother feeling that her daughter was being bullied by the Black kids. So that was her understanding that these Black students were a threat to her daughter. And she said that in no way it was the white kids that were bullying her and saying things. And that also too, she came out with this whole discussion about the kind of violence that has been enacted on African Americans since the beginning. So I was just really impressed with her ability to articulate those injustices and in a very passionate way. And also to kind of, and speak to her parents not being able to see that. And then you also have many examples of young Desi Arabs in MSAs with African Americans and even opportunities for marriage and their parents blocking that. And then so discussion around that and how they could raise awareness or change their parents' mentality. So that was already happening then. Still, those who are really able to articulate it, and like Imam Walid said, to really, articulate in a way to their folk, I still think it was just like a minority of individuals who were doing that. And so they were still very special. What I see now after the movement for Black Lives, and I guess, especially, starting with the death of Trayvon Martin, I think that there's definitely been this raised awareness on a larger scale among young Muslims in ways that I didn't even see it 20 years ago. And though there have been some critiques of moving beyond the hashtag, I still see how the hashtag itself has been a moment for dialogue, for hopefully, further reading, conversation. And that's really where it begins. You have to have these conversations, and again, go to those conversations with some humility and really genuine desire to understand each other. So absolutely, there has been a shift.
Imam, would you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay.
Can I say one thing? But of course, also Islamophobia, right? And anti-Trump resistance, or resistance to Trump. Absolutely. All of that coming together, converging. Absolutely.
One thing I'll just add is that one thing we found when we look at Islamophobia is one of the strongest predictors of Islamophobia is anti-Black racism. So the two are empirically linked. Yes. Folks need to realize the issue is there's a shared, fate no matter what. So this is a question from Fatima. She says, one of the biggest resistance I've seen in our South Asian communities is the lack of understanding on structural racism, generational trauma, and its ongoing impact. There's this model of minorities pulling up themselves by their bootstraps mentality, that we worked hard and have good work ethic, and that's the only reason why we're successful. Any recommendations on how to address this?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead first.
Well, I think actually I had a wonderful opportunity this past weekend to discuss this, because there's been a lot of discussion about the Tulsa Massacre, and when Mr. Trump came in Juneteenth, in which many Americans didn't even know about Juneteenth, into the controversy. And it actually lent an educational opportunity to talk about the Tulsa Massacre and the numerous massacres that took place, that even despite racist laws and Jim Crow and systematic means of trying to suppress Black people, that we still rose up and had prosperous neighborhoods and family life, community life, and a thriving business district. And going back to the spiritual disease of Hasid, that white folks who thought that they weren't as living as good as Black people systematically burned down thriving Black communities and financial areas all throughout America, not just Tulsa or Rosewood, or the interstate, when the interstate system under Eisenhower systematically built highways through the heart of the Black community that destroyed business districts, like in Detroit, the famous Paradise Valley. It took place in Nashville, Tennessee, right? So there are opportunities to educate people about the history, to get rid of this thing about, well, if Black folks just worked harder, they would have more. Well, no one worked harder in America to build America than the people enslaved as chattel. That's number one. And then number two, despite having to work 2 times harder than white folks, when we did build these communities, they systematically sought to undermine and destroy these. So a lot of this just has to do with education.
Yeah, absolutely. And all I'll add to that, which is also education, is understanding that with the 1965 Immigration Act, which you had the first flood of immigrants coming in from Asia and that in the Middle East, is that they were highly skilled professionals, educated. So that's something to keep in consideration, that they already had those odds in their favor, right? and I talk about that. I have a whole section on relations between African and immigrants. And others have talked about that, you know, you have this similar dynamic between African Americans and immigrants, regardless of the immigrants, right? Is that one, as Imam Dawud mentioned, because already the systematic, the systematic bringing down of our economic, our good neighborhoods and our economic forces. Not only that, but also on the other side, immigrants having certain privileges, or again, already being selected with certain skills. So we have to keep those two things in mind when we're looking at these two communities and comparing them.
Yep. Absolutely. So there's quite a number of questions. I'm just trying to figure out which ones to choose here. So this is a short one. What are concrete ways to move beyond the hashtag? Can voting help? How?
Yeah. Well, what we've mentioned here and other talks, and what I've also seen our colleagues mentioning, the reading list, so educating ourselves is one. Supporting organizations that are already doing this work, Muslim ARC, Believers Bailout, the Muslim Wellness Foundation, Imam, Chicago and Atlanta, even just supporting local masajid, local schools or other social service organizations in our Muslim communities. So supporting them financially, but also volunteering. That's another way that we can, with voting, right? Absolutely, voting, you know, it's obviously it's one among many avenues to bringing change. So that's absolutely something, and voting on the local level. CAIR is another.
So this is a question from an anonymous attendee. Does it make sense to designate a space on the board of an organization specifically for Black people? Many of these organizations don't think they have a systematic problem, even though their demographic representation and leadership isn't representative of the demographics of their community at large, i.e. around 30% of Muslims are Black, but no representation on the board.
I'm in favor of it.
I think that there needs to be some too, and more than one. It can't just be the one token person. It needs to be more, but there's going to be, I think sometimes, and I have to say this too, that all things that we view as racism doesn't necessarily mean that all of it has malicious intentions, right? So sometimes there are decisions that are made or certain speech that is said out of insensitivity that not is necessarily through malicious intention, but again, it's the lack of interaction and also a mashura, that there's not a level of like, okay, well, if you saw this press release about what took place in this city, this is the insensitivity in that certain press release, right? So if you have Black folks at the table when you're discussing these things or making decisions, then that's a way of averting those things and helping to bring about more inclusivity within inside the Muslim community. But I'll say this is controversial, but I think that we all need to hold these large Islamic organizations more accountable, and that we have a number of very prominent national Muslim organizations that claim to represent Muslims, and there's not a single Black woman or Black man on the board. And I'm saying African American, right? There's not a single African American man or woman on the board, and I think that's shameful. And I think that the constituents and the donors to those organizations need to bring that up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yes, so many of these communities are disconnected where they may not even have any members. And so maybe the first step for them would be forming some kind of relationship with the African-American or Black masjids.
That's true. But clarification, Dr. Jamillah, I was talking about these large national organizations, not the local masajid, but these large national organizations. I was referring to that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you so much for investing this time and energy on this important conversation. We are out of time, even though we have a lot more questions. So what we're going to try to do, inshallah, is put together a Twitter town hall with the panelists and address the remaining questions at a later time that will be announced in a follow-up email. So thank you all so much for joining, and especially a huge thank you to Dr. Jamillah and Imam Dawud. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.